The invasion and subsequent occupation of Iraq by the United States in 2003 marked a turning point in the country's history, leading to widespread devastation and long-lasting consequences. This video aims to shed light on the actions and policies that contributed to the destruction of Iraq and examine how the U.S. managed to evade accountability for its role in the destabilization of the nation. The historical context of U.S.-Iraq relations is crucial to understanding the events that unfolded. The U.S. had previously supported Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War and had played a significant role in the Gulf War in 1991. The imposition of sanctions on Iraq further weakened the country's infrastructure and economy. Motivations for the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 included the false claims of weapons of mass destruction and the desire to reshape the Middle East. The toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime was followed by a prolonged period of occupation, marked by the disbanding of the Iraqi army and the formation of an interim government. The consequences of the occupation were dire. The Iraqi society faced the destruction of vital infrastructure, a surge in sectarian violence, and the displacement of millions of people. The breakdown of law and order further added to the chaos, leaving Iraq in a state of turmoil. Perhaps the most troubling aspect was the lack of accountability for U.S. actions. Despite the failure to find weapons of mass destruction and the revelation of the abuse and torture of detainees at Abu Ghraib prison, those responsible for these actions largely escaped punishment. This raised questions about the effectiveness of international law and the ability to hold powerful nations accountable for their actions. In conclusion, this article seeks to unravel the dark legacy of how the U.S. destroyed Iraq and managed to evade accountability. By examining the historical context, the invasion and occupation, and the subsequent consequences, we can gain a deeper understanding of the devastating impact on Iraq and its people. Historical context of U.S.-Iraq relations. The historical context of U.S.-Iraq relations is crucial in understanding how the United States played a significant role in the destruction of Iraq and managed to evade accountability for its actions. Over the years, the U.S. had a complex relationship with Iraq, marked by strategic alliances, covert support, and subsequent conflicts. During the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, the U.S. provided extensive support to Saddam Hussein's regime, including military aid, intelligence sharing, and diplomatic assistance. This support aimed to counter Iran's growing influence in the region. However, it also empowered Saddam's regime, allowing it to carry out atrocities against its own people. The Gulf War in 1991, triggered by Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, further strained U.S.-Iraq relations. The U.S.-led coalition launched a military operation to liberate Kuwait, inflicting significant damage on Iraq's infrastructure and military capabilities. The war ended with Iraq's defeat and the imposition of harsh economic sanctions on the country. The sanctions, enforced throughout the 1990s, had a devastating impact on Iraq's economy and society. The restrictions on imports and exports crippled industries, leading to widespread poverty and suffering among the Iraqi population. These conditions laid the foundation for future conflicts and contributed to the weakened state of Iraq by the time of the U.S. invasion in 2003. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was justified on the basis of false claims regarding the presence of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, the U.S., under the administration of President George W. Bush, launched a military campaign to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime. Understanding the historical context of U.S.-Iraq relations provides valuable insights into the dynamics that led to the U.S. intervention in Iraq. The support provided to Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, the impact of the Gulf War and subsequent sanctions, and the false pretenses for the 2003 invasion all contribute to a comprehensive understanding of how the U.S. contributed to the destruction of Iraq and managed to evade accountability for its actions. The U.S. invasion of Iraq. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 stands as a pivotal moment in the history of the country, marking the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the destruction and destabilization of Iraq. The motivations behind the U.S. invasion and the immediate consequences it had on the nation. The primary justification for the U.S. invasion was the claim that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. However, subsequent investigations failed to find any substantial evidence supporting this claim. It raised concerns about the true intentions of the invasion and whether other factors were at play. The toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime was swift, as the U.S.-led coalition forces quickly overran the Iraqi military. The fall of Baghdad was accompanied by scenes of looting and chaos, leaving the city vulnerable to further unrest. The occupation that followed saw the U.S. assuming control over key institutions and attempting to establish a new Iraqi government. However, the post-invasion period was marked by significant challenges. The disbandment of the Iraqi army left a security vacuum, leading to widespread lawlessness and the rise of insurgent groups. Additionally, the lack of effective post-war planning and the failure to address basic needs, such as electricity and water, further exacerbated the situation. The U.S. invasion of Iraq also had profound social and cultural consequences. Sectarian tensions, which had been repressed under Saddam's regime, resurfaced and escalated into widespread violence. The country became divided along ethnic and religious lines, leading to a protracted and bloody sectarian conflict. Despite the destructive impact of the invasion, the U.S. managed to avoid significant accountability for its actions. The lack of clear justification for the invasion and the failure to find WMDs raised questions about the legality and legitimacy of the U.S.'s involvement. However, efforts to hold accountable those responsible for the invasion have been limited. The U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 had devastating consequences for the nation, including the destruction of infrastructure, the rise of insurgency, and the deepening of sectarian divisions. Despite the lack of concrete justifications and the subsequent destabilization, the U.S. managed to escape meaningful accountability for its actions. Occupation and post-war chaos. The occupation phase following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 marked a tumultuous period in the nation's history, characterized by widespread chaos, insecurity, and the deterioration of essential services. Delves into the challenges faced during the occupation and the subsequent post-war chaos that engulfed Iraq. After the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, the U.S.-led coalition assumed control over Iraq's key institutions. However, the disbanding of the Iraqi army without a suitable alternative left a security void, fueling resentment and contributing to the rise of insurgent groups. These groups, such as al-Qaeda in Iraq and later ISIS, exploited the power vacuum and conducted a brutal campaign of violence, targeting both Iraqi civilians and coalition forces. Furthermore, the occupation authorities struggled to establish effective governance and basic services. Essential infrastructures, including electricity, water, and healthcare, suffered from neglect and insufficient resources. The lack of basic necessities created resentment among the Iraqi population, fueling further instability. The situation worsened with the emergence of sectarian tensions. The occupation inadvertently fueled a divide between the Shia majority and the Sunni minority, resulting in a spiral of violence and retaliatory attacks. Sectarian violence reached its peak in 2006-2007, with the country teetering on the brink of a full-scale civil war. The post-war chaos and insecurity also resulted in significant displacement and humanitarian crises. Millions of Iraqis were uprooted from their homes, seeking refuge within the country or fleeing as refugees abroad. This displacement exacerbated social divisions and strained resources. Despite the clear challenges faced during the occupation and the subsequent chaos, the U.S. managed to avoid substantial accountability for its role. The lack of adequate post-war planning, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, and the failure to ensure security and basic services contributed to the deepening instability and the country's eventual disintegration. The occupation and post-war chaos in Iraq following the U.S. invasion had severe consequences. The absence of effective governance, the rise of insurgent groups, sectarian tensions, and the displacement of millions all contributed to the destruction of Iraq. Yet, the U.S. largely escaped significant accountability for its actions, leaving Iraq to grapple with the devastating aftermath. Destabilization of Iraqi society. The U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 had a profound and lasting impact on Iraqi society, leading to widespread destabilization and enduring consequences. The factors that contributed to the destabilization of Iraqi society and the far-reaching effects it had on the nation. One of the significant consequences of the U.S. intervention was the destruction of vital infrastructure. Iraq's roads, bridges, power plants, and water treatment facilities were heavily damaged during the invasion and subsequent conflict. This resulted in a severe shortage of basic services, including electricity, clean water, and sanitation, further exacerbating the hardships faced by the Iraqi people. The invasion also unleashed a wave of sectarian violence, primarily between the Shia and Sunni communities. The removal of Saddam Hussein's regime disrupted the balance of power, and long-suppressed sectarian tensions resurfaced. Extremist groups exploited this division, leading to a protracted and bloody sectarian conflict that engulfed the country for years. Furthermore, the occupation and ensuing chaos led to widespread displacement. Millions of Iraqis were uprooted from their homes, seeking refuge within Iraq or becoming refugees in neighboring countries. This displacement resulted in the fragmentation of communities, the breakdown of social fabric, and the loss of cultural heritage. The destabilization of Iraqi society also had economic repercussions. The collapse of governance systems, rampant corruption, and the lack of security hindered economic development. Unemployment soared, and poverty rates skyrocketed, pushing many Iraqis into desperation and leaving them vulnerable to extremist ideologies. Despite the significant destabilization caused by the U.S. intervention, accountability for these consequences has been limited. Efforts to address the humanitarian and social crises have fallen short, and the responsibility for the destruction of Iraqi society remains largely unacknowledged. In conclusion, the U.S. invasion of Iraq led to the destabilization of Iraqi society, resulting in the destruction of infrastructure, sectarian violence, mass displacement, and economic deterioration. These consequences continue to impact the nation today, while the U.S. has evaded significant accountability for its role in Iraq's destabilization, leaving the Iraqi people to bear the heavy burden of the aftermath. Lack of accountability for U.S. actions. The lack of accountability for U.S. actions in Iraq stands as a troubling aspect of the nation's history, raising questions about the ability to hold powerful nations responsible for their actions. The failure to address and hold accountable those responsible for the destruction of Iraq and the consequences it has had on the pursuit of justice. One of the critical factors contributing to the lack of accountability is the false pretext for the U.S. invasion. The claim of Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, was proven to be unfounded, highlighting a significant gap between the stated reasons for the invasion and the actual evidence on the ground. The lack of accountability for the false claims undermined trust and eroded the legitimacy of the U.S.'s actions. Furthermore, revelations of human rights abuses, such as the abuse and torture of detainees at Abu Ghraib prison, shed light on the disregard for international law and human rights standards. While some individuals were held accountable, many argue that the punishment did not extend to the higher echelons of power, leaving questions unanswered about who was truly responsible for authorizing and condoning such actions. The limited efforts to establish accountability for the invasion and occupation of Iraq have been marred by political complexities. The U.S. has been reluctant to subject its actions to international scrutiny, making it difficult to achieve justice through international mechanisms. Domestic efforts to address accountability have also been hampered by political considerations and legal obstacles. The lack of accountability has significant implications for the credibility of international law and the pursuit of justice. It raises concerns about the ability to hold powerful nations accountable for their actions, particularly when their actions lead to widespread devastation and human suffering. In conclusion, the lack of accountability for U.S. actions in Iraq has been a distressing aspect of the nation's history. The false pretext for the invasion, human rights abuses, and political complexities have hindered efforts to establish justice. Addressing the lack of accountability is essential for restoring trust, upholding international law, and ensuring that powerful nations are held responsible for their actions. Conclusion. The invasion and occupation of Iraq by the United States in 2003 resulted in the destruction of a nation, leaving behind a trail of devastation and enduring consequences. We have examined various aspects that contributed to the destruction of Iraq and how the U.S. managed to evade accountability for its actions. The historical context of U.S.-Iraq relations, the false justifications for the invasion, and the subsequent occupation and post-war chaos all played significant roles in the destruction of Iraq. The dismantling of infrastructure, the rise of sectarian violence, and the displacement of millions of Iraqis have left deep scars on the nation. One troubling aspect is the lack of accountability for U.S. actions. The failure to find weapons of mass destruction, revelations of human rights abuses, and the overall lack of justice for those responsible raise questions about the effectiveness of international law and the ability to hold powerful nations accountable. The consequences of the U.S. intervention continue to reverberate throughout Iraq and the broader Middle East. The destabilization of Iraqi society, the rise of extremist groups, and the ongoing challenges faced by the Iraqi people underscore the lasting impact of the U.S.'s actions. Addressing the lack of accountability is crucial for reconciliation and justice. It requires a comprehensive examination of the events, an acknowledgement of the mistakes made, and a commitment to learn from them to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Holding individuals accountable for their actions, regardless of their position, is essential for restoring trust and ensuring that the principles of justice and international law are upheld. In conclusion, the U.S.'s role in the destruction of Iraq and its ability to evade accountability are deeply concerning. It is a reminder of the importance of transparency, responsibility, and justice in international relations. Recognizing the devastating consequences and striving for accountability is vital for healing the wounds inflicted on Iraq and its people.